Before we begin, comment below which city you are watching from and what time it is there now. In 1893, a man left his home to make a decision. He never returned. There was no scream. There was no struggle. There was no body. Just an empty chair at the dinner table, a door ajar at dawn, and the heavy silence of those waiting for someone who will never arrive. His name was Thomas Ashford, 42 years old, respected carpenter, father of 3 children. Resident of a working-class village on the outskirts of Lancashire, northern England, one of those small communities where everyone knows each other by name, by trade, and also by the secrets that are never spoken aloud. Thomas was not a man of mysteries. At least he didn't seem to be. He woke up before sunrise. He worked with his hands. He came home with sawdust in his hair and the smell of fresh wood impregnated in his clothes. He sat down at the table. He ate in silence. He kissed his wife on the forehead. He went to bed early. An ordinary life. Predictable. Safe. But something in that routine was about to break. The village where Thomas lived was called Greymore, a name that seemed to have been chosen by the fog itself that covered the streets every morning. Grey stone houses, low chimneys, irregular cobblestone streets that cracked under the wheels of carts. The church bell rang 3 times a day, at sunrise, at noon, and at dusk. And it was by this bell that everyone's life was organized. Thomas lived on the main street in a narrow 2-story house with small windows and a heavy wooden door that creaked when opened. His wife, Eleanor, did sewing for others. Their children, 2 boys and a girl, attended the parish school 3 times a week. The family was well known, respected. Nothing set them apart from any other working-class family of that time, except for one detail that no one noticed until it was too late. Thomas had been acting differently. In the parish records of the time, there is a note made by the local priest, Father Edmund, dated September 1893. He wrote, "Thomas Ashford attended Mass for the 3rd time this week. Something unusual. He sat alone at the back and did not take communion. When I tried to talk to him, he looked away. He just said he needed to think. Think about what?" Eleanor also noticed. In a letter sent to her sister, found decades later among the family's belongings, she wrote, "Thomas has been distant. He doesn't sleep well. He gets up in the middle of the night and stands at the window, looking out. When I ask him what's wrong, he says everything is fine, but I know it's not. I know my husband, and the man I've been seeing lately is not him. There was something else. Something Eleanor couldn't name, but she felt it. Thomas had started going out at night. Not every day, but often enough for the neighbors to notice. He waited for the family to fall asleep, put on his coat, grabbed his hat, and slipped out the back door. He would return hours later, his shoes caked with mud and his face closed off. No one knew where he went. Some said he frequented the pub. Others thought he was in debt and meeting with loan sharks. There were those who whispered that Thomas had a mistress, but none of this was confirmed. To this day, no one knows for sure where Thomas Ashford spent those nights. What is known is this. On the night of October 17, 1893, Thomas left home for the last time. Eleanor was awake. She saw him go down the stairs slowly, as if he didn't want to be heard. She saw him stop at the door, his hand on the handle, and look back, as if he were memorizing the house, as if he knew he wasn't coming back. She said nothing. She asked nothing. She just sat there, in the dim light of the kitchen, listening to the door creak as it closed. And she never saw him again. The next morning, Thomas's chair at the breakfast table was empty. Eleanor waited. The children waited. Lunch grew cold. So did dinner. At nightfall, Eleanor went out into the street. She knocked on her neighbors' doors. She asked if anyone had seen her husband. No one had. On the 3rd day, she went to see the local sheriff, Mr. Cornelius Hale, a man with a thick mustache and a deep voice, who wrote everything down in a black notebook. He asked the usual questions. Did your husband owe money? No. Was he sick? No. Did you fight? No. Then why would he have left? Eleanor didn't know how to answer, because Thomas had no reason to disappear. He had a job. He had a family. He had a stable life. And yet, he was gone. Sheriff Hale opened an investigation. He questioned neighbors. He searched the roads. He sent telegrams to neighboring towns. He checked hospitals, prisons, nursing homes. Nothing. Thomas Ashford had simply ceased to exist. And then someone found something strange. In the carpentry workshop where Thomas worked, hidden under a loose board on the floor, there was an envelope. Inside it, a letter. It was not addressed to anyone. It was not signed. But the handwriting was Thomas's, and it simply said, "I know what I have to do. By the time you read this, it will be too late. Don't look for me. Don't try to understand. Just know that it was the only choice left. To understand what happened to Thomas Ashford, we need to go back in time, not just weeks, but years, because a man's disappearance never begins on the day he walks out the door. It begins long before, in the small decisions, in the silences, in the things he sees but doesn't say, in the questions he asks himself late at night when everyone else is asleep." Thomas was born in Graymore. He grew up in Graymore, and as far as everyone knew, he would die in Graymore. He learned the carpentry trade from his father, who learned it from his grandfather. It was a family tradition, an honorable profession. Thomas had worked in the same workshop for over 20 years. He built tables, chairs, coffins. He repaired doors, windows, wagons. He was good at what he did, reliable, punctual. Eleanor met Thomas at a summer fair in 1877. She was 17, he was 26. They married 6 months later in a simple ceremony at the church in Graymore. They had 3 children in 5 years. Arthur, the eldest, 14 at the time of his disappearance. Margaret, 12. And the youngest, William, only 9. They were an ordinary family, hard-working, close-knit. But there was something few people knew about Thomas Ashford. He read, and not just the Bible or local newspapers. Thomas read books. Books he bought from street vendors or borrowed from the priest. Books on history, philosophy, science. Books that spoke of distant places, of ideas that challenged common sense. Eleanor found this strange. She didn't understand why a carpenter needed to read about Galileo or the revolutions in France. But Thomas said he liked to think, that he liked to understand how things worked, how the world was changing, and the world was changing too fast. The 1890s were times of transformation. Factories were growing, cities were swelling, machines were replacing men. In Graymore, many carpenters had lost their jobs to industrial workshops that produced furniture in series, faster and cheaper. Thomas still had work, but he saw the future approaching, and maybe that's why he started to change. Neighbors remembered him as a quiet but kind man. He greeted everyone. He helped when he could. Once, he repaired the door of the widow Morgan's house without charging anything. Another time, he donated a table to the parish school. But in the months before his disappearance, Thomas had become increasingly withdrawn. He still worked. He still came home. He still had dinner with his family. But he was absent. Arthur, the eldest son, remembered one specific day. It was late August. He was helping his father in the workshop, sanding a board, when Thomas stopped what he was doing and stared out the window. He stood there for several minutes. Arthur asked, "Dad, is everything okay?" Thomas took a while to answer. "Have you ever thought, Arthur, about what happens when a man realizes that the life he has built is not the life he wanted?" Arthur didn't understand. He was only 14. "I don't know, Dad." Thomas continued staring out the window. "Neither do I." He never brought up the subject again. Margaret, the middle daughter, remembered something else. One night, she woke up thirsty and went down to the kitchen. Thomas was sitting at the table, alone, with a lit candle. He was writing something. When he noticed his daughter was there, he quickly hid the paper. "Go back to bed, Margaret." "What are you writing, Dad?" "Nothing important. Go to sleep." She obeyed, but she never forgot her father's expression that night. He looked scared. William, the youngest, was too young to understand what was happening. But years later he would say that in the last weeks before his disappearance, his father had started hugging him more tightly, as if he were saying goodbye. Eleanor noticed all this, and more. She noticed that Thomas had stopped making plans. Before, he would talk about fixing the roof in the spring. about planting a vegetable garden, about teaching Arthur how to work with oak wood. But in recent months, he no longer mentioned the future. He lived only in the present, as if he knew that the future did not exist. And then, there were the nighttime outings. Thomas never explained where he was going, but Eleanor knew he wasn't at the pub. She asked the owner, Mr. Callum, and he confirmed that Thomas hadn't been there in months. So where was he? Some neighbors said they had seen Thomas walking alone on the road leading out of town. Others saw him standing by the river staring at the water. Once, Mrs. Whitmore swore she saw him at the old abandoned quarry, high up on the hill late at night. But why would a man go to an abandoned quarry in the middle of the night? No one knew the answer. What is known from the records is that Thomas was dealing with something he couldn't or didn't want to share, and there is a clue to this. In Eleanor's diary, found decades later, there is an entry dated October 3rd, 1893, exactly 2 weeks before his disappearance. She wrote, "Today, Thomas asked me for forgiveness. I don't know why. I said there was nothing to forgive. He held my hand and said, 'One day you'll understand, and I hope you won't hate me.' I was confused. I asked him what he meant. He just shook his head and left the house. Forgiveness for what? What had Thomas Ashford done, or was about to do? In the days that followed, he seemed to act normally. He worked, he ate, he slept. But Eleanor knew. She knew something was wrong. And on the night of October 17th, when Thomas came downstairs and walked toward the door, Eleanor was absolutely certain he would not return. She could have screamed, she could have held him back. She could have asked where he was going, but she did none of those things. She just sat in the dim light of the kitchen, listening to his footsteps recede. And then, silence. The heavy silence of someone who knows that something has just happened. Something irreversible. When Eleanor finally got up and went to the window, Thomas had already disappeared into the darkness, and the village of Greymore, covered in night fog, seemed smaller, emptier, as if a piece of it had been torn away, and would never return. October 17th, 1893, a Tuesday. The day began like any other in Greymore. The church bell rang at 6 in the morning. Smoke rose from the chimneys, the streets filled with the sound of carts and hurried footsteps. Thomas Ashford woke up early as usual. He got dressed, he had breakfast with his family, he kissed Eleanor on the forehead, he left for the workshop, he worked all day. According to the records of the master carpenter, Mr. Harlan, Thomas was in the workshop from 7 in the morning until 5 in the afternoon. He worked on an order of chairs for the church. He didn't talk much, but that was not unusual. Thomas had always been a man of few words. At 5:15, he put away his tools. He cleaned his hands, he put on his coat, and he left. Mr. Harlan said years later that he didn't notice anything strange at the time. Thomas seemed tired, but nothing more than that. He said goodbye with a nod and walked out the door. No one knew that would be the last time anyone would see him alive, or at least the last time it was documented. Thomas returned home around 6 o'clock. Eleanor was preparing dinner. The children were in the living room. He came in through the front door, took off his hat, and hung his coat on the hook in the entryway. "It's going to rain," he said. Eleanor looked out the window. The sky was heavy. Low, dark clouds covered Greymore like a heavy sheet. "It looks like it." Thomas washed his hands in the kitchen sink. He sat down at the table. He ate dinner in silence. Eleanor tried to make conversation, but he responded in monosyllables. The children noticed the tension but said nothing. After dinner, Thomas went up to his room. Eleanor stayed in the kitchen washing the dishes. When she was done, she went upstairs too. Thomas was sitting on the edge of the bed, staring at the wall. "Are you going to bed early tonight?" Eleanor asked. He took a while to answer. "I don't know." Eleanor sat down next to him. She held his hand. It was cold. "Thomas, what's going on?" He didn't look at her. "Nothing. I know it's not nothing. I know you. I know when something's wrong." Thomas took a deep breath. He seemed to be struggling with something inside him. Something big. Something he couldn't put into words. "Eleanor," he began, but stopped. She waited. He never finished the sentence. He just squeezed her hand, got up, and left the room. Eleanor sat on the bed, listening to his footsteps going down the stairs. She knew she should follow him, that she should insist, but something paralyzed her, a strange feeling, as if she knew that whatever the answer, it would be too late to change what was about to happen. Downstairs, Thomas walked into the living room. He looked at his children. Arthur was reading. Margaret was sewing. William was sleeping on the sofa. Thomas stood there for a long moment, just watching. Then he turned and went to the back door. He put on his coat again. He picked up his hat, and he left. It was 8:30 p.m. The temperature had dropped. The wind was blowing hard. The rain hadn't started yet, but the air was damp, heavy, charged with electricity. Thomas walked down the main street. He didn't run. He didn't hide. He walked normally, as if he were just out for a stroll. Mrs. Whitmore, who lived 3 houses down, saw him pass by. She was at the window closing the curtains. She greeted him with a wave. Thomas waved back. She was the last person to see him, or at least the last one we know of. Thomas followed the road out of Greymore, the same road he had walked the previous nights, the road that led out of the village, up the hill, past the old abandoned quarry. And then, nothing. Eleanor waited until midnight, then until 1 in the morning, then until 2. At 3 in the morning she went down to the kitchen. She lit a candle. She sat down at the table, and she waited. The rain began to fall around 4, a fine, steady rain that drummed on the windows and ran down the stone walls. Eleanor did not sleep. At dawn, Thomas's chair was still empty. She went out the back door, barefoot in the rain, and walked to the street. She looked both ways. She called out to him. No one answered. That's when she realized. Thomas wasn't lost. He was gone. And somehow, she always knew it would happen. In the days that followed, the investigation began. Sheriff Hale combed every inch of the road leading out of Greymore. He questioned every resident. He examined the abandoned quarry. He searched the woods. He dragged the river. Nothing. There were no footprints. There were no tracks. There were no signs of a struggle. It was as if Thomas Ashford had simply vanished into thin air. But there was something. In the carpenter's workshop, hidden under a loose board, was the envelope. The letter he had left behind. The words he had written before leaving. I know what I must do. By the time you read this, it will be too late. Don't look for me. Don't try to understand. Just know that it was the only choice left. The only choice left. But a choice for what? Sheriff Hale tried to interpret the letter. He called Father Edmund for help. They spent hours analyzing every word, every comma, looking for clues. But the letter revealed nothing. It was just the confession of a man who had made a decision, a final decision, a decision that no one questioned because no one understood. And then, 3 weeks after the disappearance, someone found something. A boy, the son of a local farmer, was playing near the quarry when he saw something shining among the rocks. It was a pocket watch, silver, with the initials TA engraved on the cover. Thomas Ashford. The watch had stopped. The hands pointed exactly to 9:23 in the evening, October 17th, 1893. The same night, Thomas disappeared. Sheriff Hale organized a thorough search of the quarry. He brought in men from neighboring villages. They searched every crevice, every hole, every inch of that place. But they found no body. They found no clothes. They found nothing but the watch, as if Thomas had simply left it there, like a final message, like a full stop. Eleanor held the watch in her hands. She looked at the hands frozen in time. And for the first time since Thomas disappeared, she cried, because at that moment, she understood. Thomas hadn't gotten lost. Thomas hadn't been taken. Thomas had chosen, and no one would ever know why. When a man disappears, he leaves behind more than just an empty chair. He leaves questions, doubts, suspicions, and above all, he leaves people trying to understand what happened. Greymore was never the same after that night. At first, everyone believed Thomas would return, that there would be an explanation, that he had left to resolve some issue and would soon be back. But the days passed, the weeks passed, and Thomas did not return. Theories began to emerge. Some said he had run off with another woman, that he had a secret life in another city. that Eleanor simply did not want to admit it, but there was no evidence. No one had ever seen Thomas with another woman. No one had ever heard any concrete rumors. Others thought he was in debt, that he owed money to someone dangerous and had to run away to save his own life. But Sheriff Hale investigated Thomas's finances. He owed nothing. He had no debts. He had no known enemies. There were those who believed he had gone mad, that something had snapped inside his head and he had simply walked away aimlessly until he died of cold or hunger somewhere far away. But Thomas showed no signs of insanity. He worked normally, he took care of his family, he talked to people, and then there was the darker theory. Some whispered that Thomas had taken his own life, that the letter was a farewell, that the watch found in the quarry marked the exact moment he decided to end it all. But if that was true, where was the body? The quarry was searched, the river was dredged, the woods were combed. Nothing was found. It was as if Thomas had simply ceased to exist. Eleanor stopped leaving the house. She stopped sewing. She stopped going to church. She would sit by the window, looking out at the street, waiting, always waiting. The children grew up with their father's absence like a wound that never healed. Arthur took on the responsibilities of the household. He started working in the carpentry shop, the same place his father had worked. He never talked about Thomas. He never mentioned his disappearance. It was as if he had buried that memory deep in his soul and decided never to dig it up again. Margaret married at 18 and left Greymore. She never returned. Years later, when someone asked her about her father, she simply said, "He made his choice, and I made mine." William, the youngest, was the only one who continued searching. Even as an adult, even after decades, he still walked the road that led to the quarry. He was still looking for clues. He was still asking questions, but he never found any answers. And then in 1912, almost 20 years after the disappearance, something was discovered. A man was renovating the old carpentry workshop. When he ripped up the wooden floor, he found an empty space underneath, and inside that space was a metal box. Inside the box were letters, dozens of them, all written by Thomas Ashford, but they were not addressed to Eleanor, nor to his children. They were addressed to himself. Letters he wrote to himself, as if he were trying to understand something, as if he were fighting something invisible. One of them read, "I can't pretend anymore. I wake up every morning and wonder why I'm here, why I keep doing the same things every day, knowing that none of it makes sense. I look at my children and feel love. I look at Eleanor and feel gratitude, but I don't feel belonging. It's as if I'm living someone else's life, and I don't know how to get out of it." Another said, "I spoke to Father Edmund today. He said that what I'm feeling is doubt, that it's natural to question things, but he doesn't understand. It's not doubt, it's certainty. The certainty that I shouldn't be here, that I made the wrong decisions a long time ago, and now I'm stuck with them, and there's no going back." And a third, dated 2 weeks before her disappearance, "I know what I need to do. It's not easy. It's not fair to anyone, but it's the only way to stop this pain, to stop pretending, to stop being someone I'm not. Eleanor will hate me. The boys will grow up without understanding, but maybe it's better this way, better than continuing to live a lie." When these letters were read, everything made sense. Thomas Ashford hadn't run away from anyone. He had run away from himself. He wasn't in debt. He didn't have a mistress. He wasn't crazy. He was exhausted, exhausted from being who everyone expected him to be. Exhausted from waking up every day and doing the same things, following the same routines, living the same life. He had built a perfect existence in the eyes of everyone else, but in his eyes it was a prison. And on that October night, he decided to leave that prison. It is not known for certain what happened in the quarry. It is not known whether Thomas really took his own life, or whether he simply left that place behind and started over somewhere else, with another name, another identity. What is known is that he never returned, and that the clock stopped at 9:23 p.m., marking the end of Thomas Ashford. Not necessarily the end of his life, but the end of the life he no longer wanted to live. William read the letters. He cried. And for the first time in almost 20 years, he understood. He understood that his father did not abandon them because he did not love them, but because of excess weight. The weight of living a life that was not his. The weight of pretending to be happy. The weight of being perfect. Eleanor never read the letters. William thought it was better that way. She died in 1922, still waiting, still looking out the window, still believing that one day Thomas would return. And perhaps in a way he did return, not physically, but in the questions he left behind, in the choices he made, in the courage to say no to a life that did not belong to him, even if it meant disappearing, forever. Today, more than a century later, Greymoor still exists. The stone houses still stand. The church still rings its bell 3 times a day. The road that climbs up to the abandoned quarry can still be traveled, although almost no one does. And if you walk down that main street, the same street where Thomas Ashford lived, you will find a discreet plaque, almost hidden among the stones of an old wall. It simply reads, Thomas Ashford, 1851-1893, carpenter, father, missing, not born, not dead, just missing. Because to this day, no one knows for sure what happened to him. There is no body, there is no grave, there is no certainty, just a clock stopped in time, and letters written by a man who could no longer bear the weight of his own life. Local historians still debate the case. Some believe that Thomas died that night in the quarry and that his body was simply never found. Others think he ran away, that he started over somewhere else, that he lived out the rest of his days under another name, in another city, far from everything and everyone. Some say he was seen years later working as a carpenter in Liverpool. Others swear he emigrated to America. There are even those who claim he returned to Greymoor decades later, old and unrecognizable, just to see his family from afar, without ever approaching them. But none of this has been proven. What remains is only mystery. And the question that has never been answered, why would a man with a stable life, a family, a job, simply disappear? Perhaps the answer lies in the letters he left behind. Perhaps it lies in the way he looked out the window late at night, as if searching for something he could never find. Or perhaps the answer is simpler than it seems. Perhaps Thomas Ashford realized something that many of us take a lifetime to understand, that it is possible to be alive and at the same time not be living, that it is possible to have everything and still feel empty, that it is possible to love the people around you and still not be able to bear your own existence. Thomas was not a bad man. He was not selfish. He was not a coward. He was just human. And like every human being, he had a limit, a point where the mask becomes too heavy to continue wearing, a moment when pretending becomes more painful than disappearing. And on that night in October 1893, Thomas reached that point. He made a decision, the final decision, the decision that no one questioned because no one understood. Eleanor spent the rest of her life waiting for him. The children grew up with his absence like a shadow. The village whispered theories for decades. But in the end, what matters is not what happened to Thomas Ashford. What matters is what he felt, and what he teaches us. Because Thomas's story isn't just about a disappearance. It's about the invisible weight that many of us carry. It's about the choices we make to survive, and about the price we pay when we decide to live the life others expect of us, instead of the life we really want. Thomas left behind a wife, 3 children, a home, a job, but he took with him something no one else could see, the freedom to choose, even if that choice meant disappearing, even if it meant never being found again, even if it meant leaving behind everyone he loved. Because in the end, Thomas Ashford didn't disappear out of hatred. He disappeared out of exhaustion. And perhaps that is the most human thing anyone can do. Today, if you visit the old quarry, you will find the place exactly as it was over 100 years ago. Moss-covered stones, deep silence, and a strange, almost supernatural feeling that something important happened there. Not something violent, not something terrible, just something definitive. An end, or perhaps a beginning. No one knows for sure, and maybe that's for the best. Because some stories don't need answers. Some stories just need to be remembered. And Thomas Ashford deserves to be remembered, not as the man who disappeared, but as the man who chose, who had the courage or the desperation to say no, to refuse the life he was given, and to search somewhere for a life that was truly his, even if it meant never being seen again, even if it meant being forgotten, even if it meant leaving behind everything he knew, because sometimes the only way to survive is to disappear. And Thomas Ashford disappeared. Completely. Definitely. Forever. The clock stopped at 9:23 p.m., and it never started again.